Good afternoon. My name's Malcolm Allan. I work for Bloom Consulting, where my title is president. And for a long time, I've figured out I don't know what that means. But I actually do know. I introduce the star, our chief executive, and our clients. What we're going to describe to you today is, I think, an interesting phenomenon, which is that a not-for-profit, not funded by government, privately supported organization decided to do something about the lack of a coherent brand strategy for her country. Joanna will tell you a bit about that. This is our approach to coming to this conference. We don't stand up here and make hero presentations about how good we are and why you should hire us. We stand here and say, we've worked with a client, because these things are partnerships, and this is an example of how we work with a client, and Joanna will tell you about that. What we're going to do is, if the technology works, is take you through this session. I'm only going to be 2 or 3 minutes. I'll introduce it. Jose will then talk to you about how we researched the project and how we helped develop a central idea in partnership with the client. We worked with them in a very collegiate way, hand in glove, for the best part of over 1.5 years, and we worked around the world with them, with the Jewish diaspora doing that as well. Joanna will talk to you about how this bottom-up approach has actually worked, because there's some significant characteristics in there. Then we're going to hand it over for a 10-minute Q&A. Either stand up and speak to us, or use the technology. And then for the last 5 minutes, I'm going to bring it back together again to simply share with you some of the things we've learned that we can apply in other countries and are beginning to apply in other countries for this kind of approach that we think you might be interested in and can take on board. Because all too often, these presentations finish without people thinking about, well, how does it assist the field? And that's something we're very, very interested in all our work. How do we take the field towards the future? Place branding 2.0, as we call it, in a digital age. So enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Jose.
I'm sorry that you have to listen to this 1,000,000 times, and especially from me, but basically when we talk about nation branding, the best definition for our sake is the name, the feeling, the emotion whenever I say the name of that country or that place. That is the nation brand, or that is the country brand. Now, this perception and this feeling that we call the central idea impacts 5 groups of stakeholders. This perception is a tangible asset and is of extreme importance to manage it so that it actually brings value to the country. Now, this perception is only built if there's a consistency and a coherency on the actions, activities, and policies that are actually aligned with the central idea. So this consistency with the central idea on everything, or the majority of the things that the country does or the place does, is what builds this perception. Vibe Israel has hired Bloom Consulting, Vibe Israel is a non-for-profit, as Malcolm has explained, to develop a country brand strategy for Israel. And in this case, although it's not a governmental institution, we follow the same methodology. Long story short on the methodology, to summarize, there are 3 major steps. The first one is research, to understand the perceptions. The other one is developing the central idea and the strategy. And the other one is the planning and the execution of that strategy. I'm going to focus now on the situation analysis, which is the research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the data and what it means. So whenever we research countries, the first thing we try to understand is what are the priority target markets, what are the dimensions of the brand wheel that are interesting for the country and that we should analyze. In this case, the case for Israel, we're analyzing prominence, which is the general reputation. Tourism, although it's not a touristic project, it was important for us to understand the tourism dimension. I'll explain this in a little while, and talent. And the other thing that is extremely important is who is the benchmark? Who are the competitor countries or the countries of reference that I have to look at and see where we are? Let's start with the first part of the research, and which is the conclusion with the first part of the research. What we start to understand was this benchmark on the prominence dimension where Israel was. and we selected the countries together with the clients because of different reasons. But it was starting to be interesting to see that Israel, because and the reason why we chose these countries, because there are countries that the brand is under extreme stress, let's call it like this. So we tried to compare how it was. And it was interesting to see that it was not as we thought it was, which would be worse, actually, and it's not. Nevertheless, it's important to keep this mark, which is the brands or the mark where we see that above this line is where you start to generate a positive emotion. Below this, okay, although I'm very good compared with my competitors, it's important to see that it's below that specific mark. On the tourism dimension, on a different level, of course, we had to analyze other countries. You can see here the ones that are on the love mark if you want a position. Now, of course, we knew, and this is the part that is so important, the part about tourism, we needed to understand, and we knew that there was going to be a sense of people would be afraid to travel to Israel. And we wanted to understand the perception, how that feeling would be. And if the whole thing about conflict, because it's not possible to avoid the conversation about the conflict and about any perception of instability, how would that affect people? And the dimension of tourism is extremely important for us to analyze because the willingness to visit the country is an indicator of how people feel about this perception of perceived insecurity or not. And we start to see, of course, there's a big percentage that does not want to go, but there was still a big percentage that wanted to go. And, of course, the reason why they did not want to go was because of the things that I said. It was the perceived about either safety reasons or other things that was very interesting to see, like not interested. And we can see that we had different target groups that when we were analyzing the perception of the country. Now, when we start going deeper about this whole thing about insecurity, we started to go into a dimension which was the ones that have been into the country. And again, I just want to highlight one important thing, actually two important things. The second one I'll highlight later. The first thing is that none of this, everyone in the sample, we had a very, only 2% were Jewish. Everything is just international perceptions from all over the world. And this is the difference between how people perceive safety and how people perceive Israel as a safe place. And the difference between the ones that have not gone and the ones that have gone is enormous. And you can start to see, on the purple here, is the ones that consider Israel to be a safe place. So the ones that have been there see that the country is actually, is not just what everyone is talking about, but is a different country from what people talk about and what is covered in the news. Why? Because of different reasons, and because of when they go there, they see, like I did. I mean, I'm not Jewish, I've never been to Israel, so I did not know what I was going to find. And so I started to see a country like everyone else that goes there, that it's a normal country. I put normal because, yes, the conflict is there, there's an issue there, there's a problem there, but it's not just that. And that's what's important to understand. The country is not just that. And the reality tells so. And you're there and you see that it's a country that is one of the most, I would say, free in terms of gay rights, protective in terms of gay rights, it's a democracy, and so on and so forth. So it's a country that is different from what the world is thinking about. But nevertheless, we wanted to see internationally how people would see and perceive the country and what do they associate the country with. And of course, yes, violence and warfare and the conflict is there, of course, but we started to see another aspect that we were not expecting at all. And to do this, we knew, okay, look, the conflict is there, but we're starting to see a trend in other aspects that we were not thinking. And what is this? Let's try to do an exercise here, and let's try to put aside the conversation about the conflict. It's there, it's an issue, but it's not just that. It's not 100% of the country. So we created three types of categories: the off-off, the on-off, and the on-on. These categories are like we try to fill in with the answers of all the surveyed people in specific target audiences and the target markets. And it was really interesting to see that this one are the ones that are associated with the conflict. We call it the off-off. And we said, look, reality or not, it's something that we have to quantify how much people perceive this. The second one is, okay, how much people perceive Israel that is not related to the conflict and is not aligned with the brand or is not just the brand. And the other one is the one that is the reality of the country. And the result was this. I mean, we found out that 64% of perceptions were associated with aspects that are not related with the conflict. We said, well, that's really fascinating for people that have not been into the country. And the reason why you had the majority of this category here was because of one reason, and that is religion. The world thinks Israel is a religious country. And I have newsflash for you, it is not. It's part of it. And again, please don't get me wrong. I have nothing against religion, but it's not just that. And the thing about the country, a country that is perceived as a religious country, and the reality of the country is completely different. It's something, as one of the stakeholders was saying, is that it's not positive for Israel. And it's not positive for Israel because the reality of the country is a country that is dedicated to entrepreneurship, to creativity, to innovation, and it's an open and democratic country. So this quote, which was from an Olympic stakeholder that we interviewed in Israel, said, look, I think the world, the way they see Israel is like this, it's like an opponent. Is when I go into a challenge, into a match, I look at my opponent, I respect the opponent, I admire the opponent, but I don't like the opponent. So there is respect, but there's no love. And if there's no love, no money. No love, no soft power, and no soft power, no country branding, no nation branding. So that's what took us into the second phase of the project, which was, look, the reality of the country is not just what the world is talking about, and actually the world is talking about and perceiving not just the conflict as we've seen, because it's not just about the conflict, but it's about other things. So that's what we had to focus, and the reason and the way we got into the strategy and trying to understand this central idea. And the central idea, you have to understand, is not a slogan. The central idea is the feeling, it's the emotion. And I cannot say it, I cannot advertise it, I cannot communicate it. And it's not a communication strategy, because the moment I say it, I break it. So it's a secret word, let's put it this way. Okay, so the way we got into find what is this central idea was through a series of workshops with the client, following specific methodology on how actually you could get and nail what the country is all about and what it represents. So, the central idea of Israel is, ready? I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say it not because it's not a secret, it's just, that's the point. Whenever we work with central ideas and working on central idea behind the country, it's not a slogan, because if you say it, you break it. However, I'm going to talk to you about a series of other things that we call behaviors that reflect this central idea, that represent what the country is. And these things you can say, the country can say, because it's the reality that is there. With time and in time, the combination of these things that we talk about, which is represented in a culture, that you experience in the culture, which is about celebrating life, living together, getting things done, and moving forward, the combination of these things eventually will build your perception about what Israel is all about and what is the perception about the country. So these four together will then later on communicate in a different way, and then there's a narrative towards this. Now, important to say, this is not communication. This is a part of and the tip of the iceberg that we're talking about here. But it's, okay, how can the country start to talk and tell their story? And then, of course, once you have this central idea identified, you then move on into the planning. Okay, let's activate the central idea. Let's develop actions, activities, and policies. And it's important to see here that, like I said, marketing is the last thing you should do whenever we talk about nation and place branding. But last but not least, should be there, but it's the last thing that should be done. So there's policies that are extremely important for building this reputation, this perception, digital identity, and of course, the part of engagement. The combination of these things, the consistency, the coherency, and the perseverance of these, and the resilience in building and developing and implementing this is what builds the central idea. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the projects. Actually, I'm not talking about any of the projects, but of course, you can approach us and talk to us about everything in the future. So I hand it over.